Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. The night was cold, and the city felt heavier than usual. The streets buzzed with honking cars, neon signs, and people rushing past each other. But to Clara, it was nothing more than background noise. She tightened her thin coat around her shoulders as the wind slipped through the fabric. Her shoes, worn from years of use, slapped against the cracked pavement. She was a nanny, not the kind that appeared in glossy magazines or walked children through gated parks, but one who lived paycheck to paycheck, constantly worried about whether tomorrow would bring enough to cover rent. Her days were filled with feeding toddlers, wiping tears, and being dismissed by employers who barely remembered her name. Clara was invisible to the wealthy, and perhaps that was why she didn't notice the sleek black limousine that slowed as it approached her. The tinted window slid down just enough to reveal a man inside. His face was sharp, his expression unreadable, and his gaze lingered on her with unsettling precision. Miss Clara Evans. His voice was smooth, carrying the weight of authority. She froze. No stranger should have known her name. Her fingers clutched the strap of her worn handbag. Yes, she whispered, cautious. The man extended a gloved hand, offering an envelope. You've been requested. By Mr. Damien Hale. Her stomach dropped. Damien Hale. Everyone in the city knew his name. A millionaire whose fortune stretched across industries, hotels, tech, even real estate. His reputation was as sharp as his tailored suits. Cold, brilliant, ruthless. He was a man who didn't believe in second chances. Clara blinked at the envelope as though it might burn her fingers. I think you have the wrong person, she said quickly, her voice betraying her nerves. But the driver only shook his head. He insists it is you. She didn't understand, not until she opened the envelope later that night in her tiny apartment. Inside was a letter stamped with Hale's insignia. The words made her pulse quicken. You are to report to Hale Manor tomorrow morning. A contract will be prepared. Compensation will be beyond what you've ever earned. Refusal is not advised. Clara sat at the edge of her narrow bed, the letter trembling in her hands. What could a man like Damien Hale possibly want with her? She was just a nanny, poor and forgettable. Sleep didn't come that night. Her thoughts ran wild. Was it work? A trap? A cruel joke? Yet the promise of money tugged at her. Money meant rent. Money meant food. Money meant survival. The next morning, she stood before the gates of Hale Manor, her knees nearly buckling. The mansion was unlike anything she had ever seen. Sprawling acres, marble fountains, iron gates taller than any building she'd ever lived in. The air smelled faintly of roses and freshly cut grass. The gates opened soundlessly, as if they had been expecting her. Inside, she walked through endless corridors of polished marble and chandeliers. Portraits of ancestors lined the walls, their eyes following her every move. Servants whispered as she passed, their glances sharp, curious, mocking. Finally, she entered a study. At the far end, behind a desk carved from oak, sat Damien Hale. His black suit was immaculate, his posture commanding. He didn't rise. He didn't smile. He simply regarded her like a man assessing a contract, not a person. You're late, he said. Clara's throat tightened. She wasn't late. She had arrived 10 minutes early. I don't understand why I'm here, she murmured, her voice fragile but steady. Damien leaned forward, his gaze piercing. You are here because I require someone suitable. And for reasons you may not yet see, you are the one I've chosen. Her heart pounded. Chosen? For what? The air between them felt heavy, filled with questions she dared not ask. And then he slid a folder across the desk toward her. Inside was a contract. Clara's fingers hovered over the folder as though it were laced with fire. Her instincts screamed to push it back across the desk and run from the mansion, from Damien Hale, from whatever trap was hidden between those pages. Yet she couldn't. Something about his eyes, sharp, unyielding, made her feel pinned to the chair. Her voice cracked as she finally asked, "What kind of contract is this?" Damien leaned back, folding his hands in a way that made his movements appear calculated, almost rehearsed. "A simple agreement," he said. "You will remain in this house under my employ. Your duties will extend beyond child care. You will attend functions, dinners, public appearances. You will carry yourself with grace and discretion. In return," his gaze flicked to her worn shoes, to the fraying hem of her coat, to the trembling hand she tried to hide in her lap. "You will never worry about money again." Clara's stomach nodded. The words sounded like salvation and threat all at once. "Why me?" she whispered. Damien's jaw tightened. "Because you are unencumbered. No ties, no scandals, no past worth digging into. I require someone. Invisible. Someone who can stand at my side without distracting the world from what truly matters." Invisible. The word stung, though he had spoken it with precision, not cruelty. Invisible was exactly what Clara had been her whole life. Unseen, overlooked, unchosen. Yet here she was, chosen for something she couldn't yet name. She opened the folder. The papers inside were covered in fine print, paragraphs dense with legal language. Her eyes tripped over words like non-disclosure, commitment of presence, exclusive arrangement. But one line made her heart stumble. Clause 12. The contract shall remain in effect for a minimum duration of 12 months, during which Miss Evans shall be recognized, both in public and private, as the personal companion of Mr. Damien Hale. Her hands shook. Companion? Not nanny. Not employee, companion. Her eyes darted up. This isn't about work, is it? Damien's expression didn't change. It is work. Make no mistake. But the nature of appearances in my world requires more than labor. It requires loyalty, endurance, a face the press can latch onto. And you, Miss Evans, will be that face. Her heart thundered. You want me to pretend to be what? The words stuck in her throat. Your partner? A shadow of a smile flickered at his lips, though it carried no warmth. Call it what you will. Pretend if you must. All that matters is that the world believes it. Clara felt her lungs tighten, as though the marble walls of the study were closing in. She wanted to refuse. She wanted to scream that she was not some ornament to be paraded for his reputation. But then she thought of her apartment. The leaking roof, the landlord's threats, the unopened bills stacked on her table. She thought of the nights she had gone without dinner so she could send money to her younger brother, still in school. Her voice cracked. And if I say no? Damien's eyes darkened. He didn't raise his voice, but the weight of his answer sank like stone. Then the offer vanishes. And so will opportunities you cannot even imagine. Clara swallowed hard. It wasn't just the money. It was survival. This contract, cold and suffocating as it felt, was a lifeline she could not afford to cut. Still, her pride wrestled inside her chest. She clenched her fists, forcing her voice to steady. And what happens when the year ends? For the first time, Damien's gaze softened, though only slightly. When the year ends, Miss Evans, you will walk away richer than you ever dreamed. And free. Until then, your life belongs here. The silence stretched between them, heavy and sharp. Clara's mind swirled with every reason to run, every whisper of doubt that screamed this was a mistake. But the image of her brother's thin frame, of bills she couldn't pay, of the gnawing hunger she had grown too used to, anchored her. Her hand trembled as she reached for the pen. Damien's eyes followed her every movement, unreadable, as though he were watching a game play out exactly as he had planned. The pen touched the paper. Her signature sprawled across the bottom line. Clara Evans had just signed away a year of her life. When she placed the pen down, she expected Damien to look triumphant, maybe even smug. But instead, he simply gathered the papers, stacked them neatly, and slid them back into the folder. His movements were calm, detached, like a man who had closed a business deal rather than sealed someone's fate. It is done, he said, his voice smooth, final. From this moment forward, you belong to Hale Manor." Clara's breath trembled. She had signed for money, for survival, for the faint hope of a better tomorrow. But she hadn't expected the words that came next. Damien rose from his chair, his height casting a shadow across her. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. Then, with a deliberate calmness, he added, "And soon, Miss Evans, the world will not see you as a nanny. They will see you as something else entirely." Her lips parted, her voice caught between disbelief and dread. "And what is that?" Damien's gaze locked with hers, cold and unwavering. "My bride." The words struck harder than any signature could. Clara's breath hitched. The contract had not bound her to work. It had bound her to him. The following morning, Clara stood before the iron gates of Hale Manor again. But this time she wasn't an outsider. She was bound. The weight of the contract in her bag felt heavier than stone, pressing against her ribs with every breath. The gates creaked open without a word from her, as though the mansion already knew she was expected. Clara's heart thudded against her chest as she stepped through. The gravel crunched under her worn shoes, sounding far too loud in the silence of the sprawling estate. The manor rose above her like a fortress, endless windows glinting in the pale sun, marble columns reaching high, the kind of home built to intimidate. To Clara, it felt less like a house and more like a cage dressed in gold. At the entrance, a line of staff waited. Men in pressed suits, women in crisp uniforms, their eyes sharp and judgmental. The butler, tall and stone-faced, stepped forward. "Miss Evans," he said curtly, though his tone carried no warmth. "Or perhaps I should say, Mrs. Hale in waiting." His words dripped with disdain, and the faintest ripple of laughter spread among the staff. Clara's cheeks burned, but she said nothing. She lowered her gaze, clutching her handbag like a shield. She wanted to disappear, but disappearing wasn't allowed here. Not anymore. The butler led her inside. The foyer was vast, glittering with chandeliers that spilled golden light across marble floors. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors loomed from the walls, each frame larger than the last, their gazes following her every move. As she walked, she heard whispers ripple behind her. "She's so plain." "A nanny? He brought her here? Perhaps it's temporary. It must be." The words cut, each one sharper than the last, but Clara kept her chin slightly lifted. She had survived worse. Empty cupboards, eviction notices, the cruel pity of strangers. She could survive their whispers, too. The butler stopped before a grand staircase. "This way," he said. "You'll be residing in the East Wing." Her own wing? The thought startled her, though it carried no comfort. The corridors stretched endlessly, lined with gilded mirrors and velvet drapes. It was beautiful, yes, but it was beauty meant to remind her she did not belong. Finally, the butler pushed open a set of double doors. Inside was a room larger than her entire apartment. A bed draped in silk, windows framed with velvet curtains, a chandelier sparkling above. A wardrobe stood ready, already filled with dresses that were not hers. Gowns in satin and lace, shoes polished to perfection, jewelry that gleamed even from a distance. Clara stood frozen in the doorway. "This isn't mine," she whispered. The butler arched a brow. "It is now. You will wear what Mr. Hale requires. Appearances must be maintained." And just like that, he left her alone. Clara moved slowly, afraid to touch anything. She traced her fingers along the edge of the vanity, the fabric of the gowns, the gold-framed mirror that reflected a face she hardly recognized. For the first time, she saw herself as they might see her. Not a nanny, not a servant, but a stranger in a world that glittered like ice. The door opened suddenly. Clara spun, her breath catching. Damien Hale entered. He looked just as he had the day before. Sharp suit, polished shoes, eyes that cut through her like a blade. He didn't smile. He didn't greet her. He simply studied her, as though assessing whether she would fit into the life he had forced upon her. "You'll attend dinner tonight," he said finally. "The staff will prepare you." Clara swallowed. "Dinner?" "With the board, the press, and half the city's elite," Damien replied smoothly. "It is time they meet you." Her throat tightened. "Meet me?" "But You are under contract," he interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "From this moment, you are not Clara Evans, Nanny. You are Clara Evans, companion to Damien Hale, and they will address you as such." Her heart pounded. "I don't belong at a table like that." For a moment, something flickered in Damien's gaze. Not kindness, not softness, but a sliver of curiosity. "Belonging," he said quietly, "is not given. It is taken. Remember that." And with that, he left her, his footsteps fading down the hall. Clara sank onto the edge of the silk-draped bed, her hands trembling. The gowns in the wardrobe seemed to mock her, glittering in colors she had never dared to wear. Tonight, she would be seated beside Damien Hale, the cold, unreadable man who had bought her presents with ink and signatures. The thought twisted in her chest. She had signed for money, for survival, but already she realized the true cost was far greater. The staff's whispers echoed in her ears. The portrait eyes seemed to watch her, waiting to see if she would shatter. And in that vast, gilded room, Clara whispered to herself the only promise she could hold on to. Do not break. No matter what they do not break. The dining hall of Hale Manor was a palace in itself. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls, and the long oak table gleamed under golden light. Servants in immaculate uniforms carried trays of silver and porcelain, their movements practiced and silent. Clara's stomach churned as she followed Damien into the room. She wore one of the gowns chosen for her, a dark blue satin that hugged her too tightly at the waist. The diamonds at her throat glittered under the light, but she could feel their weight pressing against her skin like chains. Every pair of eyes turned toward her. The board members, investors, and high society guests fell silent for a moment, as if struggling to understand why Damien Hale, the untouchable millionaire, had walked in with her. Whispers began almost immediately. "Who is she?" "A nanny," I heard. "Can you imagine? Surely he's lost his mind." Clara's cheeks flushed. She kept her chin high, but her heart pounded so loudly she thought they must hear it. Damien didn't notice. Or perhaps he didn't care. His hand rested lightly against her back as he guided her to the head of the table, his expression cold and unreadable. He sat without hesitation, claiming his place of power. She sat beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap, wishing she could disappear into the shadows. The dinner began. Waiters poured wine into crystal glasses, and the room filled with polite laughter and the clinking of cutlery. Clara picked at her food, unable to taste anything. Then it began. Across the table, a woman in pearls leaned toward her companion, speaking just loudly enough for Clara to hear. "That dress looks borrowed, doesn't it?" Another chuckled. "Borrowed? More like forced onto her. Look at her hands. She's holding the fork as though it's a weapon." Laughter rippled around the table. Clara's chest tightened. She focused on her plate, forcing herself not to react, not to let them see how the words pierced her. But the voices only grew bolder. "Perhaps Mr. Hale is making a charity project of her," one man said smoothly, his glass raised. Admirable, though questionable taste. The table erupted in muffled laughter. Clara's throat burned. She wanted to excuse herself, to run from the room, but Damien's presence beside her held her in place. He didn't defend her. He didn't scold them. He simply sipped his wine, his face unreadable, as though her humiliation were none of his concern. Something inside Clara shifted. For the first time, she realized the contract hadn't bought her safety. It had bought her silence. She was expected to endure, to withstand their cruelty while sitting perfectly still beside the man who had put her here. Her hands trembled under the table. She remembered the words she had whispered to herself in her room. Do not break. So, she didn't. When the woman in pearls turned to her directly and said, with false sweetness, "Tell us, Miss Evans, how does one go from scrubbing floors to dining at a table like this?" Clara lifted her eyes. Her voice was soft but steady. The same way one goes from eating off gold plates to forgetting the taste of humility, I suppose. The table fell silent. For one brief moment, the cruelty froze on their lips. Clara lowered her gaze again, her heart hammering, but she had said it. She had not broken. Damien glanced at her. His expression gave nothing away, but his eyes lingered a moment longer than usual. The dinner continued, though the whispers didn't stop. Clara endured, each word another knife, but she held her head a little higher now. She had not collapsed. She had not let them see her bleed. She had not let them see her bleed. Later that night, when the last guest had left and the servants had cleared the hall, Clara slipped out to the balcony for air. The night was cool, the city lights blinking faintly in the distance. She gripped the marble railing, her shoulders trembling. She didn't hear Damien until he spoke. "You handled yourself." Clara turned. He stood in the doorway, his suit immaculate, his expression still unreadable. "You said nothing," she whispered, her voice sharp with the sting of truth. He didn't flinch. "They are jackals. They feed on weakness. You gave them none." Her throat tightened. "And if I had, would you have cared?" For the first time his eyes softened, though only slightly. "You signed the contract, Miss Evans. You knew this world would not welcome you." Clara swallowed hard, anger rising in her chest. "I signed because I had no choice. Don't mistake survival for consent." Her words hung in the night air, sharp and trembling. For a long moment Damien said nothing. Then he turned away, his voice low. "Strength looks good on you, Clara." He disappeared into the shadows of the hall, leaving her on the balcony, the night air stinging her cheeks. Clara closed her eyes, clutching the railing. She had survived her first dinner. She had survived their whispers, but survival was not the same as living. And deep inside, she wondered how many more nights like this she could endure. The days after the dinner felt like walking through glass. Clara carried the whispers with her, tucked inside her chest where no one could see the bruises. Yet she didn't let herself bend. She woke each morning, dressed in the gowns provided, and carried herself with quiet dignity, even when the staff's stares cut sharper than knives. But Damien watched. He didn't speak of that night, nor did he defend her when the gossip reached his ears. But sometimes Clara felt his gaze linger longer than before, always fleeting, always hidden behind a mask of indifference. But there. One evening, a storm rolled across the city. Rain pelted the tall windows of Hale Manor, thunder rumbling like a warning. Clara sat by the fire in the East Wing library, sketchbook balanced on her knees. It was her one comfort, blank pages where she could pour the chaos of her thoughts. Tonight, she sketched the chandelier from the dining hall, each crystal a teardrop glistening with unspoken pain. A shadow stretched across the page. She looked up. Damien stood in the doorway, his suit jacket damp, his hair tousled from the rain. His eyes flicked to the sketchbook, then back to her face. "You draw," he said, his tone more observation than question. Clara closed the book quickly, embarrassed. "It's nothing. Just habit." But he stepped inside, his movements slower than usual, as though he, too, was unsure. "It isn't nothing," he said quietly. "It's detail, precision. You see things most people ignore." For the first time, his voice lacked its usual steel. Clara didn't reply. She couldn't. Her throat felt tight. Damien's eyes lingered on her a moment longer, then he turned, as if retreating from something he hadn't meant to reveal. "Dinner will be ready soon," he said, and left her to the fire. That night, when she returned to her room, she found a small gift on the vanity. A leather-bound sketchbook, untouched, its pages crisp and white. No note, no signature. But she knew. The change was small, but it cracked something in her walls. Another night, Clara discovered Damien's humanity in a quieter way. He had locked himself in his study for hours, refusing meals, the sound of his voice low and clipped as he spoke into the phone. Worry gnawed at her. Against her better judgment, she prepared a tray herself, soup, bread, a cup of tea, and carried it to his study. She knocked softly. No answer. She left the tray by the door. Hours later, when she passed again, the tray was gone. The next morning, as she entered the breakfast hall, she saw Damien already seated. He glanced at her, just for a moment, and instead of the cold nod he usually gave, he said, "Good morning, Clara." Her heart stumbled. It was only 2 words, but his voice carried a softness she hadn't heard before. Her kindness didn't go unnoticed by others either. The staff, once wary and mocking, began to soften in her presence. She learned their names, asked about their families, listened to their stories. She helped the gardener plant roses near the fountain, her hands stained with soil, her laughter ringing softly through the courtyard. It unsettled Damien. He wasn't used to warmth filling his home, a place that had always been more fortress than family. One afternoon, he passed through the garden and stopped when he saw her kneeling by the fountain, her hair escaping its pins, her smile gentle as she brushed dirt from her palms. For reasons he couldn't explain, he lingered. Watching her brought a strange ache he hadn't felt in years. The turning point came one rainy evening. Damien returned late, his suit soaked, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion. Clara waited in the foyer, umbrella in hand, though she had no reason to. When the car pulled up, she hurried out, shielding him from the downpour. "You'll catch cold like this," she said softly, lifting the umbrella above him. Damien froze, staring at her. The concern in her voice was real, unguarded, without agenda. For a moment, the weight of his world, contracts, mergers, power struggles, lifted. He almost thanked her. Almost. But instead, he stepped past her, his tone clipped. "I'm fine." Later that night, he entered his study to find a steaming cup of tea waiting on his desk. He stared at it for a long time, then finally lifted it to his lips. The warmth spread through him, easing the tension in his chest. He knew she had left it. He knew, too, that he hadn't felt this kind of quiet comfort in years. Clara noticed the shift in him, though she told herself not to. He lingered at the breakfast table longer than before, sometimes asking about her sketches, sometimes listening to her stories of the children she once cared for. His questions were never many, his face never revealed much, but she felt it, the walls lowering. Piece by piece, and once, during a charity luncheon, when a guest made a cutting remark about her plainness, Clara responded calmly, shifting the conversation to art and architecture with surprising eloquence. The table fell silent, intrigued. Damien's gaze snapped to her, surprise flickering across his face. He didn't say anything then, but later that evening she noticed something new in his eyes. Respect? Still, Clara reminded herself. This was not love. This was a contract. His small gestures, his softened words, could not erase the cold truth of what she had signed. But alone in her room, as she traced the fresh pages of the sketchbook he had given her, she couldn't deny it. Something was changing. Damien Hale was no longer just the ruthless man who had trapped her in ink and paper. Beneath the armor, she had glimpsed something fragile, something human, and though she tried to bury it, a dangerous thought stirred in her chest. What if he was more than the contract? The gala was everything Clara feared it would be. Glittering chandeliers, velvet gowns, diamonds flashing beneath golden light. It was a theater of wealth, and she was the wrong actress on the stage. Damien's hand rested lightly at the small of her back as they entered the ballroom. To the crowd, it was a gesture of possession. To Clara, it was nothing more than a reminder. You are bound to me by contract. Whispers followed them, sharp and cruel. She's the one. A nanny at Hale's side? Unthinkable. He must be amusing himself. Clara held her head high, her heart hammering. She reminded herself, do not break. Not here. Not now. The night blurred with introductions, glasses of champagne she barely touched, polite nods from people who looked at her as though she were made of glass too fragile to handle. Damien was impeccable as always, his voice smooth, his expression cool. He introduced her when required, but his words carried no affection, only obligation. And then the rival appeared, Cassandra Vale. Her name alone carried weight in the city. Heiress to an oil empire celebrated for her beauty and ruthlessness alike. She had once been linked to Damien. In rumors, in whispers, in quiet expectation. Many had believed she would be his bride. Until Clara arrived, Cassandra swept across the ballroom in crimson silk, her smile polished, her eyes glittering with malice. She reached Damien first, brushing her manicured hand against his arm as if no time had passed. Damien, she purred. "How long has it been?" "Too long." He inclined his head politely. "Cassandra." Her gaze flicked to Clara, and her smile sharpened like glass. "And this must be the new companion." She let the word drip with disdain. Clara felt the eyes of the room turn toward her, waiting for her to falter. Her throat tightened, but she forced a small smile. "Clara Evans," she said softly. Cassandra's laugh was delicate, cruel. "Evans, was it? My dear, I can't imagine what life must be like, to go from scrubbing floors to dining at tables like these. You must feel quite misplaced." A ripple of laughter spread among the crowd. Clara's cheeks burned, but she steadied her voice. "I suppose every palace needs someone to remind it what humility looks like." Remind it what humility looks like. Her words sliced through him. For the first time, Damien's carefully constructed armor cracked. But before he could speak, Clara turned and walked past him, her gown brushing against the stone floor like a closing curtain. He stood there in silence, the echo of her voice and Cassandra's laughter colliding in his mind. For the first time, Damien Hale felt something unfamiliar. Guilt. That night, Clara sat in her room, her sketchbook open on her lap. She drew the terrace, the lights of the city blurred by tears. She pressed the pencil harder than usual, the lines jagged, unsteady. She whispered to herself, the words breaking in her throat. "Hold your dignity. Hold your dignity." In the next wing of the house, Damien stood at his window staring out into the storm. For years, he had believed strength meant silence, that power meant indifference. But Clara's voice haunted him. "I only wanted your respect." And for the first time, he wondered if all his wealth, all his walls, had left him weaker than the woman he had bound to him. The weeks after the gala dragged like shadows. Clara moved through Hale Manor quietly, her footsteps soft against marble floors, her heart heavier than she let anyone see. She still smiled at the staff, still tended to the roses in the garden, still filled her sketchbook with drawings, but inside she felt hollow. Damien's silence haunted her more than Cassandra's cruelty. He had been beside her when she needed him most, yet he had chosen pride over protection. That wound festered in ways she couldn't hide. But change was stirring. Another grand event loomed on the calendar, a charity auction held downtown, where the city's wealthiest gathered to flaunt their fortunes in the name of generosity. Clara dreaded it, but she was bound by the contract. Damien insisted she attend. The ballroom glittered like a sea of golden glass. Guests laughed and clinked glasses of champagne, their eyes always sharp, always watching. Clara stood at Damien's side in a gown of silver silk. She looked radiant, though she felt small beneath the weight of their stares. And then Cassandra appeared again. She glided across the floor in scarlet velvet, her beauty deliberate, her smile sharpened to a blade. She wasted no time. "Clara," Cassandra said sweetly, her voice carrying just far enough to draw attention. "Or do you prefer Miss Evans? I admit I'm surprised you're still here. I assumed Damien would have grown tired of his experiment by now." The crowd chuckled. Clara's hands tightened around her clutch. She willed herself not to tremble. Cassandra stepped closer, her eyes glittering. "Why don't we let everyone see the truth, Take off that veil of dignity you wear. Show them the face Damien was forced to marry." Gasps rippled across the room. Whispers rose like a storm. Clara froze. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She felt cornered, her dignity slipping like sand through her fingers. Cassandra reached as if to tug at her arm. And then a hand shot forward. Damien's. He stepped in front of Clara, his eyes blazing, his voice cutting through the room like thunder. "Enough, Cassandra." The ballroom fell silent. "You will not speak to my wife that way," Damien continued, his voice low but carrying across every corner of the hall. "Not here. Not ever," the crowd gasped. Murmurs rippled. Wife. The word hung heavy in the air. Cassandra laughed, brittle, desperate. "Wife? Damien, look at her. She's nothing compared to what you could have had." "Look at yourself," Damien snapped, his tone sharper than any blade. "Draped in jewels, dripping with venom. And yet you stand here empty. Clara has more dignity in her silence than you will ever have in your noise." The words struck like lightning. The ballroom buzzed with shock. Damien turned then, his voice softer but no less commanding. "Clara, you don't have to hide anymore." Slowly, deliberately, he lifted her chin so every eye in the room could see her. Gasps spread like wildfire. She was beautiful. Not in the polished, artificial way society adored, but in the quiet strength of her eyes, in the resilience etched into her posture. For the first time, the crowd saw not a nanny, not an experiment, but a woman who belonged exactly where she stood. Cassandra's face twisted, fury breaking through her mask, but it was too late. The tide had turned. Whispers of scorn shifted to awe. Damien reached for Clara's hand, his grip firm, protective. He raised it high for all to see. "This is my wife," he declared, his voice steady and unshakable. "And no one will question her place beside me again." The room erupted in murmurs. Photographers snapped pictures, flashes filling the air like sparks. Cassandra stumbled back, her smile finally cracking, her power unraveling. Clara stood frozen, her chest heaving. For weeks, she had endured cruelty alone. For weeks, Damien had let her face the storm without shelter. And now, here he was, standing before the world, shielding her, claiming her. Her throat tightened. She wanted to believe it. She wanted to trust it. But her heart still carried the wound of his silence. Later, in the limousine ride home, silence filled the air. Not the cold, distant silence she had grown used to, but a charged silence, heavy with words unsaid. Damien sat across from her, his eyes searching her face. "Clara," he said finally, his voice low, "I should have spoken sooner. I failed you." She looked out the window, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold. One act of courage doesn't erase weeks of silence. His jaw tightened. "No, but it's a start," her chest ached. She wanted to believe him, but fear and doubt coiled inside her. She turned her face away, whispering, "Respect isn't a performance, Damien. It's a choice. Every day, every moment." He didn't argue. He only nodded, his voice raw. "Then let me prove it to you. Not tonight, not in words, but in everything I do." Clara's heart trembled. She didn't answer. But for the first time since she signed the contract, she felt something stir. Not just survival, not just dignity, but the dangerous hope of being truly seen. That night, as she sat alone in her room, Clara opened her sketchbook. Her pencil moved across the page, sketching the ballroom. But this time, she didn't draw the cruel laughter or Cassandra's mocking smile. She drew Damien's hand around hers, and for the first time, she allowed herself to wonder, what if this was more than a contract? The days after the charity auction unfolded like a dream, Clara couldn't quite trust. Everywhere she went, whispers followed her. But they weren't the same whispers as before. "Did you hear what Hale said? He called her his wife. And did you see her? She's not plain at all. Clara ignored them. Words were still words, no matter how sweet. She had learned that they could cut as sharply as they could flatter. But Damien's actions, those were different. The morning after the event, Clara expected the usual silence at breakfast. Damien seated at the far end of the table, his phone glued to his ear, business deals spoken over coffee. But instead, he was already there, waiting. When she entered, he set the phone aside. "Good morning," he said. Clara paused, startled. "Good morning." It was only 2 words exchanged, but the weight of them shifted something in the room. He gestured to the seat beside him. "Sit here." Hesitant, Clara obeyed. For the first time since arriving at Hale Manor, she didn't feel like an ornament at the far end of the table. She felt acknowledged. Damien began to linger more often. When she sketched in the library, he'd step inside, pretending to browse the shelves, but his eyes always drifted toward her drawings. One evening he asked, "May I?" and carefully turned the pages of her sketchbook. He stopped at a drawing of the ballroom, the night he had defended her. "You drew this," he murmured. Clara's chest tightened. "It helps me remember, or forget." His gaze lingered on the page. "You drew me better than I deserve." For once, his voice carried no arrogance, only honesty. In the garden, he surprised her again. Clara was kneeling by the fountain, brushing soil from her hands after helping the gardener plant roses. Damien crouched beside her, his suit out of place among dirt and petals. "They've survived," she said softly, gesturing to the roses they'd planted weeks ago. "They did," he agreed. His eyes weren't on the roses. They were on her. "Just like you." Clara froze, her breath catching. For the first time, she saw not the cold, calculating millionaire, but a man shedding his armor, even if only for a moment. She pulled her hand away from the soil, her heart racing. "Words are easy, Damien." "Then let me prove them," he said quietly, and prove them he tried. He no longer ignored her at social events. He walked beside her, his hand firm at her back, his introductions carrying not obligation, but pride. When someone dared to mutter a cruel remark, his sharp gaze silenced them before words could take root. At home, his presence shifted. He joined her in the library, sometimes reading while she sketched. He asked about the books she loved, the places she dreamed of seeing. He listened, truly listened, as though her words carried more weight than the contracts he lived by. Clara felt her defenses trembling. Clara felt her defenses trembling. The laughter faltered. A few murmurs of surprise echoed, but Cassandra only arched a brow, her smile never slipping. "Oh, humility," she said sweetly. "That must explain your dress. Satin, isn't it? The cut is rather simple. You really should let Damien take you shopping, darling. It's embarrassing walking beside him in something so plain." Clara swallowed hard, her hands tightening at her sides. She wanted to disappear, but her dignity anchored her feet. The crowd chuckled again, louder this time. And through it all, Damien said nothing. He stood beside her, silent, his expression unreadable. The silence cut deeper than Cassandra's words. Clara glanced at him, her eyes pleading for something, a word, a gesture, anything to shield her. But his lips remained sealed, his pride a wall between them. Her chest ached, her throat burned, but she refused to give Cassandra the victory of tears. She lifted her chin, her voice steady though it trembled inside. "Better plain than cruel." Cassandra's eyes narrowed though her smile stayed fixed. "Cruelty, my dear, is simply honesty dressed in red." She turned her back with a laugh. Drawing the crowd with her, the moment passed, but the damage lingered. When the evening ended and the guests drifted away, Clara slipped onto the terrace, her gown trailing against the marble floor. She leaned against the balustrade, her chest tight, her hands trembling. The city lights blurred through tears she refused to let fall. Damien found her there. "Clara," he began, his voice low. She turned sharply, her eyes burning. "You said nothing." He froze. "They laughed at me. They mocked me, and you stood there like I was invisible." Her voice cracked, but her anger was sharp. "Do you know what that felt like?" Damien's jaw tightened, his eyes shadowed. "Cassandra thrives on spectacle. If I had reacted, it would have fueled her further." Clara's laugh was bitter. "No, Damien. If you had reacted, it would have shown me I wasn't alone." The words hit him harder than she realized. She clutched the railing, whispering more to herself than to him. "This contract, I thought it meant security. But all it means is humiliation. I signed for survival, not for this." Damien stepped closer, his voice quiet, almost strained. Perhaps this was a mistake. Clara's heart twisted. She looked at him, her eyes glistening, her voice steady but aching. "If I must endure this alone, then I will. But I do not need your pity. I only wanted your respect." One night she found him in the kitchen long after midnight. He was standing by the counter, sleeves rolled up, trying, and failing, to make tea. "What are you doing?" she asked, laughter bubbling despite herself. He glanced up, caught, and almost smiled. "Trying to do what you do for me every night. It seems I'm less capable than I thought." She moved beside him, guiding his hands gently. Their fingers brushed, and the warmth lingered longer than it should. When the tea was finally poured, Damien handed her the cup. "Thank you," he said softly, "for waiting for me in the rain, for the tea, for everything." Clara lowered her gaze, her cheeks warm. She sipped the tea, the silence between them heavier than words, but Clara wasn't ready to surrender. Late one evening, she confronted him in the library. Her sketchbook lay open between them, her hands trembling as she spoke. "You say all the right things now," she whispered, "but I can't forget the nights you said nothing. The nights I stood alone while they tore me apart." Damien's face hardened, not in pride, but in pain. "I was a coward," he admitted. "I thought silence was strength. I thought indifference was protection. But I was wrong. And if you let me, Clara, I will spend every day proving it." Her eyes burned. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust the sincerity in his voice, the rawness she had never heard before, but fear still coiled inside her. "Actions matter. Damien," she whispered. "Then watch me," he said simply. For the first time, Clara felt the walls between them begin to crack. When she lay in bed that night, she stared at the ceiling, her sketchbook resting on her chest. She thought of his hand in hers, of his voice declaring her his wife before the world, of his midnight attempts at tea. The contract had bound her here. Duty had chained her to him, but something else was stirring now. Something dangerous, fragile, and undeniable. Clara Evans was falling. It happened on a night meant to glitter. The Hale Foundation's annual gala, the crown jewel of Damien's calendar, filled the grand hall with chandeliers and music. Gowns trailing like rivers of silk. For the first time, Clara felt less like an outsider. She walked at Damien's side not as an ornament, but as his equal, his gaze lingering on her with something that looked dangerously close to tenderness. But Cassandra Vale was not done. She swept into the gala like a storm in crimson, her smile a mask stretched too tightly. All eyes followed her as she crossed the room, but her gaze was fixed on Clara. The moment came during the speeches when the crowd's attention should have been on the stage. Cassandra stepped forward, glass in hand, her voice carrying with cruel clarity. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said sweetly, "we toast tonight to truth. And the truth is this: Damien Hale, our city's most powerful man, has been shackled by pity, tied to a woman unworthy of his name. A contract bride, a fraud." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Murmurs rose like waves crashing against marble walls. Clara froze, her throat tightening. The word fraud pierced deeper than any dagger. Cassandra smirked, savoring the silence. "Tell me, Damien, will you let this masquerade continue?" The room turned to him. For one heartbeat, Clara feared his old silence would return, that he would let the storm swallow her whole. But Damien Hale stepped forward. "Enough!" His voice cut through the noise like thunder. He took Clara's hand, his grip steady, unshakable, and turned to face the crowd. "Cassandra is right about one thing," he said, his gaze sweeping across the room. "Clara Evans did not come from wealth. She was not born into power. But make no mistake, she is no fraud." He looked at Cassandra then, his eyes blazing. "The fraud is you, a woman who mistakes cruelty for strength, who believes love can be bought with status, when the truth is, she's never known love at all." Cassandra's face twisted, her mask finally cracking. Damien turned back to the crowd, his voice firm. "Clara is my wife, not because of a contract, not because of appearances, but because she is the only woman who has ever had the courage to stand beside me when everyone else cowered. She has my respect, my loyalty, and my heart. And if anyone here doubts her place beside me, you may leave." Silence followed. Not disbelief, reverence. Whispers rose, but they were different now. Admiring. Awed. Clara's heart pounded. She had braced herself for humiliation, but instead, Damien had given her something she never expected. Protection, loyalty, and something more dangerous still. Love. Cassandra's glass slipped from her hand, shattering against the marble floor. Her smile vanished as she turned sharply, retreating from the ballroom in a storm of silk and fury. Damien squeezed Clara's hand, his voice low but steady, just for her. No more silence. Not ever again. Her chest trembled, her eyes burning. For the first time, she believed him. The night of the gala marked the end of Cassandra's reign, but for Clara, it marked something greater, the shift from survival to freedom. The contract that had once chained her now sat forgotten in Damien's study. A year had not yet passed, but its power no longer mattered. Their bond had grown into something neither ink nor signature could contain. Days later, Clara stood in the garden by the fountain, the roses she had planted now in full bloom. The morning sun bathed the petals in gold. She touched them gently, remembering the day she had whispered to herself, "Do not break," and she hadn't. Behind her, she heard footsteps. Damien. His presence no longer carried the cold weight of command, but something warmer, softer. "You've changed this house," he said quietly. Clara turned, startled. "This house?" He stepped closer, his eyes steady. "And me?" Her throat tightened. She wanted to deny it, but the truth shimmered in his gaze. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the contract, its edges worn from handling. Slowly, deliberately, he tore it in half. Then again, and again, until nothing remained but scraps carried away by the breeze. Clara's breath caught. "Damien, no more contracts," he said firmly. "No more obligations. If you remain here, it will not be because of ink and signatures. It will be because you choose it." Her eyes stung. For so long, she had been bound by necessity, her choices buried under poverty and survival. And now, for the first time, someone was handing her freedom. For the first time, someone was handing her freedom. "Why?" she whispered, his voice softened, raw and unguarded. "Because I love you. Because I cannot imagine this house, this life, without you in it. Clara Evans, you were never invisible to me. You were the only one I truly saw." Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. All the nights of humiliation, of whispered cruelty, of doubt and fear, they melted under the warmth of his words. Damien took her hand, his grip gentle but unyielding. "So now I ask, not as a contract, not as a bargain, but as a man stripped of everything but the truth. Will you stay, not as my companion, not as my obligation, but as my bride, my equal?" My heart, Clara's chest trembled. She remembered the night she first stepped through the gates of Hale Manor, trembling in fear, whispering to herself not to break. She remembered the cold dinners, the cruel whispers, the storms endured alone. And she remembered the moments of humanity, the sketchbook, the roses, the midnight tea. Slowly, she nodded, her voice breaking but steady. "Yes, not because I must, but because I choose to." Damien's lips curved into the faintest smile, the first true smile she had ever seen from him. He bent his head, pressing his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling in the morning air. The roses swayed gently in the breeze, as though bowing to the union they now witnessed. Clara was no longer the poor nanny who had signed away her life in desperation. She was a woman who had endured cruelty and found strength, who had been chosen and had chosen in return. And as the sun rose higher, bathing them both in light, she whispered the truth she had once feared to believe. She was not his contract bride. She was his true bride,